A humiliated woman faces public mockery from her ex at an elite gathering, unaware that she's secretly bound to the most feared and powerful vampire king who never tolerates disrespect toward those he protects. She stood frozen as her ex's laughter echoed through the crystal ballroom. His cruel words about her underprivileged state cutting deeper than any blade. Completely unaware that the most dangerous predator in 1,000 years was already watching from the shadows. The golden chandeliers of the Blackstone Manor cast dancing shadows across marble floors as Manhattan's elite mingled in their finest attire. Isabella smoothed her emerald silk dress, her fingers trembling slightly as she checked her phone for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. Still no message from him. She promised Nicole she could handle tonight alone, that facing her past wouldn't break her. But standing in the grand ballroom where she'd once felt so small, doubt crept through her chest like ice water. Across the room, her ex-fiancé, Daniel Rothschild, held court near the champagne fountain, his arm draped possessively around a blonde socialite half his age. His eyes found Isabella's, and a cruel smile spread across his lips. She knew that look, the same one he'd worn when he humiliated her at their own engagement party 2 years ago, calling off their wedding in front of everyone because she was just a scholarship kid, pretending to belong in his world. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, in the ancient castle overlooking New Orleans, Nicholas Mickelson stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection absent in the glass. His supernatural hearing had caught every heartbeat spike, every shallow breath Isabella had taken since entering that ballroom. His jaw clenched as he sensed her distress through the blood bond they shared. The original vampire, the first of his kind, had lived for over 1,000 years, but nothing had ever tested his restraint like staying away when his beloved was in pain. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Rebecca. "The private jet is fueled and ready. Just say the word, Nick." He'd promised Isabella space to face her demons, to prove to herself that she was strong enough to stand in that world without him. But as he felt another wave of her humiliation crash through their bond, his eyes flashed gold with barely contained fury. Some promises, he realized, were meant to be broken. Before we continue with what happens when the most powerful being on earth decides his woman has been disrespected long enough, I need you to hit that subscribe button. Don't leave me hanging here. One click means everything to a creator who lives for these dramatic moments. Also, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I absolutely love knowing where my vampire family is scattered across the globe. What do you think Nicholas should do? Should he respect Isabella's wishes to handle this alone? Or is it time for the Vampire King to make an appearance? Let me know in the comments what you'd do if you were the most powerful supernatural being and someone was hurting the person you love. The orchestra's waltz seemed to slow as Daniel approached. Champagne flute in hand, his entourage of old money vultures following like scavengers, sensing blood. Isabella lifted her chin, forcing her spine straight, but her pulse hammered against her throat. Well, Isabella Chin. Daniel's voice carried across the immediate vicinity, drawing curious stares. Still flying solo, I see. Tell me, darling, how does it feel to be the only woman over 25 in this room without a ring? The words hit like a physical blow. Conversations around them quieted, designer gowns rustling as heads turned toward the spectacle. Isabella's breath caught, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Some of us prefer quality over convenience, Daniel." His laugh was sharp, practiced, designed to cut. "Quality, or are you still that little scholarship girl who couldn't quite fit into our world?" 2 years, Isabella. 2 years since I saved us both from that disaster of an engagement, and you still can't land a proper husband. Maybe it's time to lower those impossible standards. The blonde on his arm giggled behind manicured fingers. Around them, phones discreetly angled to capture the drama. Isabella felt the walls closing in, her carefully constructed confidence crumbling like ash. Every insecurity she'd buried, every night she'd wondered if she truly belonged anywhere, came rushing back. What she didn't know was that 3,000 miles away, ancient eyes had turned completely black with rage. Isabella's hands trembled as she reached for her clutch, desperate to escape before the tears threatening behind her eyes could fall. She would not give Daniel the satisfaction. "Not again," she whispered, but Daniel stepped closer, blocking her path. "Excuse me?" she managed, but Daniel stepped closer, blocking her path. "Oh, come now, don't run away like last time. Surely you can handle a simple conversation among old friends." His voice dripped false concern. "I'm actually trying to help. Maybe if you stopped chasing fairy tales about perfect love, you'd find someone willing to overlook your background." The word background sliced through the air like a blade. Isabella felt every eye in the ballroom on her, felt the weight of judgment from people who'd never had to fight for their place at any table. Her throat burned with unshed tears and rage she couldn't release. "My background made me who I am," she said quietly, but her voice lacked its usual fire. "Exactly." Daniel smiled coldly. "A beautiful girl with champagne tastes and a beer budget mentality. Some men might find that charming initially, but for marriage, for building a real legacy—" He shrugged. "Well, the results speak for themselves." Isabella's vision blurred. She wanted to scream, to tell him about the man who loved every part of her story, who saw strength where Daniel saw shame. But she'd promised Nicholas this was her battle to fight. She'd promised herself she was strong enough. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, Nicholas crushed his phone in his bare hands, supernatural speed already carrying him toward the door. As Isabella tried to move past Daniel's circle, his friend Marcus stepped sideways, creating a wall of designer suits around her. They weren't done with their entertainment. "You know what I think, Dan," Marcus chimed in, his words slurring slightly from expensive whiskey. "I think our Isabella is holding out for some knight in shining armor. Still believing in those romance novels, aren't you, sweetheart? Maybe she's waiting for a vampire." The blonde giggled, and the group erupted in laughter. Isabella's blood ran cold at the word. If they only knew how close to the truth they were, how the man she loved could hear her heart break from across a continent, how he was probably fighting every instinct right now to stay away as she'd asked. "A vampire would be perfect for her," Daniel continued, emboldened by his audience's reaction. "Something that exists only in fantasies. Just like her standards, just like her pride, just like her belief that she deserves better than what real men in the real world are willing to offer." The ballroom suddenly felt suffocating. Isabella's chest tightened as she realized she was trapped, not just by their bodies, but by the growing crowd of onlookers with their phones and judging stares. Every exit seemed blocked by curious faces eager to witness her humiliation. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "The king protects what belongs to him, always." Isabella's heart stopped. That wasn't Nicholas's number, but those words, only he would phrase it exactly that way. Isabella's thumb hovered over the mysterious text as memories flooded back to 6 months ago when her world had shattered and rebuilt itself in a single night. She'd been walking home late from her job at the art gallery, taking a shortcut through the French Quarter during her business trip to New Orleans. The 3 men who had cornered her in that dark alley had no idea they were about to become a lesson in why certain women were protected by forces beyond human comprehension. She could still remember the sound like thunder rolling across silent earth when Nicholas had appeared. Not walked, not run, but simply materialized from shadow itself. The way he'd moved faster than her eyes could track. The way those men had dropped without him seeming to touch them. And then his voice, accented with 1,000 years of authority, "No one touches what is mine." "Mine?" she whispered now, the word lost in the ballroom's chaos. What was that? Daniel leaned closer, his breath reeking of arrogance and alcohol. Finally ready to admit defeat, Isabella looked up at him, really looked at him, and for the first time saw how small he truly was, how terrified he'd always been of anyone who couldn't be bought, controlled, or diminished, how he tried to break her spirit because her strength highlighted his weakness. "I said, mine," she repeated, her voice growing stronger. "I belong to someone who makes you look like a frightened child playing dress-up." Daniel's face darkened. "Really? And where is this mysterious boyfriend tonight? Convenient how he never seems to exist when you need him." What Isabella couldn't tell him was that Nicholas had begged to come tonight. He'd paced his study like a caged predator, making plans to buy the entire hotel just to ensure her safety. But she'd asked him to let her prove she could face this alone, to show herself she was more than the broken girl who'd been humiliated before. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She'd fallen in love with the most powerful being in existence, and yet here she was, feeling powerless again. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was definitely Nicholas, his real number. "You are not alone, love. You have never been alone. Look toward the balcony." Isabella's eyes lifted, scanning the upper level of the ballroom. There, in the shadows between marble columns, she caught a glimpse of movement. Not him. He'd promised to stay away, but she recognized the figure. Elijah, Nicholas's brother, dressed impeccably as always, his presence both reassuring and ominous. Another text. "My brother has been watching over you all evening. Did you truly think I would leave you unprotected among wolves?" Despite everything, Isabella smiled. Even when respecting her independence, Nicholas had found a way to keep her safe without breaking his word. It was so perfectly him, honoring her request while ensuring she was never truly vulnerable. "What are you smiling about?" Daniel's voice turned sharp with irritation, finally cracking under pressure. "No," Isabella said softly, her confidence returning as she felt the invisible thread connecting her to the man who had spent months showing her what real love looked like. "I'm thinking about how wrong you are, about everything." She thought about Sunday mornings in Nicholas's study, reading while he painted. How he'd spent decades collecting first editions of her favorite books. How he'd learned to cook human food just to make her breakfast. How this ancient, fearsome creature became gentle as a lamb in her presence, yet would burn the world down if anyone threatened her. "You want to know the truth, Daniel?" Isabella straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I found someone who makes you look like a scared little boy. Someone who sees my background as a strength, not a weakness. Someone who values me for exactly who I am." Daniel laughed, but it sounded forced now. "And yet, he's nowhere to be found when you need him most." Isabella's smile turned mysterious. "Who says he isn't here?" Daniel's face flushed red with embarrassment as several people nearby began whispering, clearly intrigued by Isabella's newfound confidence. He couldn't afford to lose face in front of his peers. His reputation was everything in this world. "Enough!" he hissed, grabbing Isabella's wrist hard enough to leave marks. "You're embarrassing yourself with these delusions. Time for a reality check." Isabella tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Let go of me, Daniel. Not until you stop this pathetic fantasy and face facts." His voice rose, drawing more attention. "You're alone, Isabella. You've always been alone. Nobody wants damaged goods from the wrong side of town. You're hurting me," Isabella said quietly. But Daniel's humiliation had transformed into something darker, more dangerous. "Good," he sneered. "Maybe pain will teach you what kindness couldn't. You need to learn your place." Marcus stepped closer, emboldened by his friend's aggression. "Should have stayed broken up, Dan. Some people never learn to be grateful for what they can get." Isabella's heart hammered as she felt truly trapped for the first time. This wasn't just social humiliation anymore. This was threatening to become something worse. Daniel's grip was cutting off circulation, his face twisted with a rage that seemed disproportionate to her defiance. "Please," she whispered, genuinely frightened. "Now you're scaring me." "You should be scared," Daniel said coldly. "You should have been scared 2 years ago when you thought you could embarrass me by having standards above your station." The ballroom seemed to shift around them, conversations dying as people began to notice the aggressive tone. But instead of helping, they watched like spectators at a gladiator match, phones discreetly recording what they sensed might become a viral moment. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling more alone than she had since that terrible night 2 years ago when Daniel had publicly destroyed her. She thought she was stronger now, thought love had healed those wounds. But facing this pack of predators in designer clothes, she felt like that same broken girl who had cried herself to sleep for months. Her phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering to the marble floor. That's when the lights went out. The ballroom plunged into complete darkness, not the flickering of a power outage, but the absolute black of something supernatural. Emergency lighting should have kicked in immediately, but even that failed to penetrate the unnatural shadow that had descended. In the darkness, Daniel's grip loosened with confusion and fear. Gasps and nervous laughter rippled through the crowd as people fumbled for phone flashlights that somehow refused to work. Then came the voice, rich, accented, carrying the weight of centuries and the promise of violence. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating through the very walls. "I believe someone has made a grave error in judgment." The temperature in the room dropped 20 digs in an instant. Breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Isabella's heart soared even as terror gripped everyone around her. She knew that voice, knew the power behind it. Who is that?" Daniel stammered into the darkness, his bravado evaporating. "I am Nicholas Mikkelsen," the voice continued, closer now, as if circling them like a predator. "And you, insignificant little man, have just made the gravest mistake of your very short life." A single spotlight blazed to life in the center of the ballroom, revealing a figure that shouldn't have been possible. Nicholas stood there in a perfect black suit, not a hair out of place, despite having traveled 3 Zozeran miles in what must have been minutes. His eyes, when they found Daniel, glowed with an inhuman golden fire that made several people in the crowd whimper. "You touched what belongs to me," Nicholas said conversationally, his tone almost pleasant. "Almost. Now I have a choice to make. Do I simply kill you, or do I get creative?" Daniel released Isabella so fast she nearly stumbled, his face pale with terror he couldn't understand but felt in his very bones. "This is impossible," Daniel whispered. "You can't just... You weren't here. How did you?" Nicholas smiled, and it was beautiful and terrible. "Oh, my dear, insignificant Daniel, there are forces in this world that make your little power games look like children playing with toys. I am 1 suzerain years old. I am the first vampire, the original hybrid, and I have just traveled across a continent because someone dared to hurt the woman I love." Isabella stepped toward Nicholas, her fear melting into overwhelming relief and love. He opened his arms and she fell into them, feeling his supernatural strength and warmth chase away the last traces of humiliation and doubt. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his chest. "I thought I could handle this alone." "You could have," Nicholas murmured, his voice gentle now as he held her. "You were magnificent, but you never have to handle anything alone again." His eyes hardened as they shifted to Daniel, who was backing away slowly. "However, there are consequences for those who harm what I protect." With supernatural speed that made the crowd gasp, Nicholas appeared beside Daniel, gripping his shoulder with casual strength that could have crushed bones. You will never speak to her again. You will never look at her again. In fact, I believe an extended vacation to a very remote location would benefit your health immensely." Daniel nodded frantically, tears of terror streaming down his face. "Furthermore," Nicholas continued pleasantly, "you will liquidate half your assets and donate them anonymously to scholarship funds for underprivileged students. Consider it payment for my restraint and for not tearing your throat out." With a dismissive flick of his wrist, Nicholas sent Daniel stumbling backward. The man fled toward the exit, his entourage scattering like leaves before a hurricane. The lights returned to normal as Nicholas walked back to Isabella, taking her hands in his. "Now, my love," he murmured, "I believe you mentioned something about marrying the most powerful vampire king?" Isabella laughed, her earlier tears replaced with joy. "Did I say that?" "You did, and I happen to know one who's been waiting centuries to find his queen." But he dropped to one knee right there in the ballroom, producing a ring that seemed to capture starlight itself. "Isabella Chin, will you marry me and let me spend eternity showing you how a real man protects the woman he loves?" The ballroom erupted in gasps and applause as Isabella said yes, echoing through the Crystal Palace like a promise of forever. 6 months later, the ancient cathedral in New Orleans had witnessed many ceremonies over its centuries of existence, but never one quite like this. Isabella stood before a mirror in the bride's chamber. Her wedding dress, a masterpiece of ivory silk and vintage lace that had belonged to Nicholas's mother from 1,000 years ago, altered by the finest seamstresses money could buy. "You're trembling, love," Rebecca observed, adjusting the antique veil with gentle hands. "Having second thoughts about marrying my impossible brother?" "Never." Isabella smiled, though her hands did shake slightly. "It's just, this is really happening. 6 months ago, I was a nobody getting humiliated at a party, and now I'm about to become queen of the oldest supernatural family in existence." Rebecca's expression grew serious. "There's something you should know before you walk down that aisle. Being a Michelson isn't just about the love and protection. There are enemies, ancient ones, who will see you as a weakness to exploit." As if summoned by her words, the cathedral's stained-glass windows suddenly rattled with an inhuman force. Isabella's blood ran cold as supernatural speed echoed through the halls outside, but not the familiar controlled movement of her soon-to-be family. "What was that?" Isabella whispered. Elijah burst through the door, his usually perfect composure cracked with urgency. "We have a problem. The Salvatore brothers have arrived with a rather large contingent of vampire hunters. They claim Nicholas has violated some ancient treaty by planning to turn a human bride." Isabella's heart sank. She'd known this day might come. The supernatural world had rules, politics, ancient grudges that stretched back centuries, but she'd hoped their happiness could exist without interference. "They want to speak with you," Elijah continued. "Apparently, the bride has the right to choose her fate freely, without influence." "Influence?" Isabella's voice rose with indignation. "They think Nicholas compelled me." Through the bond she shared with him, she felt Nicholas's rage building like a supernatural storm. His voice echoed in her mind, "Stay where you are, love. I'll handle this." But Isabella Chin had spent her whole life being underestimated, and she wasn't about to start her marriage by hiding behind her supernatural fiancé. She lifted her chin with the same defiance that had caught a vampire king's attention. "No," she said firmly. "I'll speak with them myself." She walked into the cathedral's main hall to find Nicholas facing off against Damon and Stefan Salvatore, along with a small army of armed humans. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. "Gentlemen," Isabella announced, her voice carrying through the sacred space, "I understand you have concerns about my mental state." Damon Salvatore smirked. Well, the infamous bride. Tell me, sweetheart, Do you have any idea what you're marrying into? The body count, the centuries of blood. I know exactly who I'm marrying, Isabella replied calmly. I'm marrying a man who would burn the world down to protect me, but who learned to paint watercolors because I mentioned loving art, a man who reads me poetry in languages that died out centuries ago, but still gets nervous asking if I want coffee in the morning. Stefan stepped forward, his expression gentler, but equally concerned. Isabella, we just want to make sure this is truly your choice. No compulsion, no supernatural influence. Isabella laughed, the sound bright and genuine. Supernatural influence. You mean like how he waited 3 months to even kiss me, because he wanted to be sure I could handle the truth about what he was? Or how he spent half a year trying to talk me out of turning into a vampire because he's terrified of taking away my humanity? She walked closer to Nicholas, taking his hand. This man has given me more choice and freedom than any human ever did. So yes, this is my choice, my free, completely uncompelled choice. Nicholas squeezed her hand, his eyes soft with love and pride. My brave, magnificent queen, he murmured. Damon rolled his eyes. Oh, please. This is nauseating. What's nauseating? Came a new voice from the cathedral entrance. Crashing someone's wedding, that's what. Everyone turned to see Catherine Pierce striding in, followed by Caroline Forbes and Bonnie Bennett. Isabella's eyes widened. She'd heard stories about these women from Nicholas, but never expected to meet them. Catherine, Stefan breathed, what are you doing here? Bringing a wedding gift. Catherine smiled wickedly, producing an ancient scroll. Turns out there's a loophole in that precious treaty you're all worried about. If the bride proves her worthiness through trial by choice, she's automatically granted protection under supernatural law. Trial by choice? Isabella asked. Bonnie stepped forward, her expression kind but serious. 3 tests, mind, heart, and soul. If you pass, no supernatural being can ever question your right to be here again. Isabella looked at Nicholas, seeing the worry in his ancient eyes. He'd lived long enough to know these trials were dangerous, potentially fatal, but she also saw his absolute faith in her strength. I accept, she said without hesitation. The first test came immediately. Bonnie's magic filled the cathedral with whispered voices, every cruel word Daniel had ever said to her, every moment of doubt and shame from her past. The magic tried to convince her she was unworthy, unloved, that Nicholas would eventually see her as the damaged goods Daniel claimed she was. But Isabella had spent 6 months being loved by someone who saw every flaw and chose her anyway. The whispers bounced off her like rain off glass. Mind test complete, Bonnie announced, impressed. The second test materialized as a vision. Nicolas in danger, chained with vervain, soaked bonds, his enemies offering Isabella a choice. Walk away forever, and he lives, or stay, and watch him die for her. Without hesitation, Isabella stepped toward the vision. I choose to stay and fight beside him. Always. The vision shattered. Heart test complete. The final test was the cruelest. Isabella suddenly felt every death Nicholas had caused in his 1,000 years, every moment of darkness in his past, every reason she should run from him. The weight of it threatened to crush her spirit. But then she remembered his gentle hands as he helped her heal from Daniel's cruelty, his patience as she'd learned about the supernatural world, the way he'd held her during nightmares and made her feel safe for the first time in her life. He was broken, she said aloud, tears streaming down her face, just like I was, but we healed each other. His past doesn't define him any more than mine defines me. Golden light exploded through the cathedral. All tests complete, Bonnie announced with genuine admiration. She is worthy beyond question. The Salvatore brothers and their hunters bowed respectfully before departing, the ancient treaty satisfied. As the cathedral bells began to ring, signaling the start of the ceremony, Nicholas cupped Isabella's face in his hands. "My brave, incredible queen," he whispered, "you faced down supernatural law itself for us. I'd face down the devil himself for you." Isabella whispered back, "Now, didn't someone promise me a wedding?" The ceremony was perfect, ancient vows spoken in multiple languages, a unity ritual that bound not just their hearts, but their very souls, and a kiss that made the cathedral's windows glow with supernatural light. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Isabella caught sight of Daniel in the very back pew, looking smaller and more miserable than ever. He'd apparently come to see what he'd lost. Nicholas followed her gaze and smiled wickedly. "Shall I have him removed, Mrs. Mickelson?" Isabella considered for a moment, then shook her head. "No, let him watch. Let him see what real love looks like, what a real man does for the woman he loves. Maybe he'll learn something." As they stepped into the New Orleans sunlight, transformed by love and magic into something eternal, Isabella realized she'd never felt more powerful, more worthy, more completely herself than she did in that moment. Not despite her past, but because of how she'd chosen to rise above it. "Ready for forever, love?" Nicholas asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief and adoration. "With you," Isabella grinned, standing on her toes to kiss her vampire king husband. "I've been ready since the moment you appeared in that ballroom like an avenging angel." "Avenging angel?" Nicholas chuckled as they climbed into their vintage Rolls-Royce decorated with white roses and ancient protective charms. "I rather like that." And as they drove off toward their honeymoon in the Scottish castle, where Nicholas had been born over a millennium ago, Isabella knew she'd finally found where she belonged. Not in Daniel's narrow world of judgment and limitation, but in a love story that would literally last forever. The scholarship girl and the vampire king, proving that sometimes the most impossible love stories are the ones most worth fighting for. And that's how you handle bullies when you're dating a 1,000-year-old vampire king. But seriously, if you made it this far without subscribing, you're breaking my heart worse than Daniel broke Isabella's. I just gave you the most epic supernatural romance showdown, stayed up until dawn, perfecting every twist, and you're really going to scroll away without hitting that button. Don't do me like that. Subscribe now and join the fastest growing vampire love stories community on YouTube, where epic love stories and supernatural justice collide every single week. You belong here with us. So make it official. What was your favorite moment? Nicholas's grand entrance, the way he handled Daniel, or that epic ballroom proposal? And tell me, would you want a 1,000-year-old vampire protecting you, or is that too much power for one relationship? Drop your thoughts below. I read every single comment and love hearing what moments made you fall in love with these characters.